Mornings on WKVT 100.3 FM and AM 1490. It is 6:39 and 64 degrees. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and I have in the studio with me Shanta Lee, Gander, and Stephanie Greene from the People's, Places, and the History of Words Project. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you so much.
So I would love to hear, just to start off, the project has been ongoing, but this week for the Literary Fest you are launching your first big exhibits, is that correct?
Absolutely.
So what is happening?
Well, we have two launches. One is the exhibit at the Brooks Memorial Library called Brattleboro's Letterpress Years. And this focuses on the history of the town as a printing and publishing center in the 19th century. And then we also have the Miles Project, which
Yes.
Shanta will tell you about.
So the Miles Project is an interactive mobile unit which will change in terms of its focus of who or what is being featured in terms of people, places, and history of words. And we are launching with Lucy Terry, also known as Lucy Terry Prince, wife of Abijah Prince. Which is very fascinating history.
And she used to live in Guilford, correct?
Yes, they not only lived in Guilford, they owned land during a time that was very rare for blacks, let alone free blacks or black Americans to own land anywhere in the United States.
Because she was a contemporary of the 1700s.
Yep, that's accurate.
And she had been born outside of Vermont, but then moved to Vermont?
She actually was born in Africa. She was taken from Africa
Okay.
around the age of 4 or 5 years old.
Wow.
Birth date somewhere between 1724 and 1726. Lands in Rhode Island, and then ends up in Deerfield, Massachusetts. And in fact, the house where she served as a servant under her masters, they also had a tavern where she would tell her stories and engage guests. It's a part of the historic village in Deerfield, Massachusetts.
That's right, because one of her well-known poems, is it called Bar Fight?
Bars Fights.
Bars Fights. Thank you. And it's about an attack on Deerfield.
An attack on Deerfield. She would have been around, I would say, in her early 20s when this would have happened. And the fascinating thing about this poem, it did not exist in print until about 100 years after her death.
Oh, wow.
So it survived orally being passed down. And it is, I believe, one of the only accounts of that incident. So there you have it. It kind of outlines what happened.
Mm-hmm. So this is a good example for listeners. We just started this conversation, and we were only talking about one literary figure in the area, and yet how deep did that just go? So she is a great example of how deep the storytelling and literary history is in this area, that we sometimes take it for granted. And so the Miles Project, it's like a tiny house, right?
Yeah, it's a tiny portable, it's a mobile unit, and we're still going to be trying to figure out where it will be, who will be able to engage with it. The project actually has a base that includes a number of partners. So we have 5 local nonprofit organizations, which include the Brooks Memorial Library, as Stephanie already mentioned, the Right Action Group, the Brattleboro Literary Festival, the Brattleboro Historical Society, and you also have 118 Elliott. So all these groups, and Marlboro College. So all these groups coming together for this about 3.5-year grant. It's a matching grant for about $150,000.
And it's from the National Endowment of the Arts?
Humanities.
Humanities,
Yes.
Thank you. See, this is why I ask questions. Because you have all the answers. And for folks this week, where do they find information about the exhibits and what's happening?
Well, there's a website that I think is the Brattleboro Words Project, which a foreshortened name for our group, and the Literary Festival the website will probably have information on it.
And you can search for it also on social media. And so yes, as Stephanie mentioned, it's brattleboro.com/words, or just search Brattleboro Literary Festival, or Lucy Speaks is also a Facebook event. They're both Facebook event pages, so you can look for them and find details.
Wonderful. So what brought each of you to this project?
So you go.
Okay. I was intrigued. There were several initial meetings, and at the time I was overseeing the Arts Council of Windham County, and it was a curiosity to see how we could be engaged, because while it's not it's not from the National Endowment of the Arts, words and printing are very much an art form. So we were really curious about any points of synergy, and also personally, I was intrigued by the really deep history, which I'm sure Stephanie can also share, of print in this area. Not just print, but our ability to just really bring all of these individuals from all over the place, like pull them to the area to create, which was really fascinating. So in the beginning, we were all trying to figure out what were we going to do, and what was going to be the focus, and how could we make this a robust 3.5-year project.
And Stephanie?
Well, Lissa Weinman is one of the people spearheading this, and her vision is, I would say, encyclopedic, if not comprehensive. But I came actually by accident. I work on the Literary Festival. I do Vermont Voices, which is writers from Vermont. And Sandy couldn't make one of the meetings, Sandy Rouse, who runs the Literary Festival. And she said, could you just sit in for me? And I got fascinated. And it did seem as though there were a lot of people coming in with some very interesting points of view that had kind of been glossed over and maybe scattered over the years. But my family was involved in publishing in the 20th century, and I knew a lot of the people who had been working at printing and publishing and writing and book design, and the people who were very carefully, quietly, modestly chronicling those activities and kept things from earlier times, from the 19th century even. So I really wanted to make sure that chunk was well represented, so hence the exhibits and so forth.
Well, one thing that draws my attention to this project is even I, who grew up in this area, knew very little about its publishing and printing history. And if I remember this correctly, and I could be wrong, some of the early editions of like Harry Potter
Absolutely.
were printed here.
At the book press.
At the book press. And how many people know that?
Oh, I know.
And well, also many years later, I believe somewhere in the 60s, I would have to fact check it, one of the Rumi books printed here, the Bible being first printed and mass produced, starting here in this area.
Wow.
And there were all sorts of publications that were national publications that were printed and produced here. So, and people, George Crowell and Deacon John Holbrook and all sorts of people were really interested in making this a hub, and worked very hard to do that in the 19th century.
So what changed? How did we forget about our printing and literary history? I think we still have a lot of working writers.
Oh yeah.
But that industry section of the equation, what changed?
That's a really good question, right?
Outsourcing.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the printing industry is very rarely local anymore. You know, you don't have a local print shop, whereas, you know, in old Deerfield, every single little town had its own print shop and its own newspaper, and now it's much more centralized, and a lot of other media have maybe taken the place of printed matter.
And I also would add too, I think that I worked on a piece that was in the Commons, I want to say maybe last month, and I think there's a way in which we've just forgotten our history wholesale around so many things, and even throughout the country there's definitely sometimes is a lack, or I always call it temporary, or that's redundant, amnesia, a bit of amnesia, and so where we forget the full context of our history, specifically with this area, because if you, look at things like the SD Oregon building and business, and how that drew artisans from throughout Europe to here, or things like the water cure, and remembering our history for finding what it is that we have that is great and as a resource, and leveraging it to draw others to it and show them how special it is. And hopefully through the people, places, and history of words in Brattleboro, that might be a bridge back into some of our history to reclaim it and remember what a gem this area is, and also inspire people to really dig into the history right in their own backyards.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. So at the Literary Fest, just remind folks what they can find and where they can find it.
So you'll be able to either find information right on the Facebook event page if you look for the Brattleboro Literary Festival. You also can go to the Brattleboro Literary Festival website. I'm so bad with websites, but you can Google it, you'll find it right there. There are events kicking off from Friday all the way through Sunday, I believe.
Thursday, actually.
Oh, Thursday. I stand corrected, Thursday.
Yeah.
Everything from poetry readings to a short story.
There's a short story panel. There are
18, yep.
There's Vermont Voices, which highlights Vermont writers. There's a wonderful, Tanya Stone is bringing Girl Rising, which is the story of education for girls worldwide. It's really broad, so it's really fun. And let's remember that for a town of 12,000, we have 5 great places to buy books in this town. That is beyond unusual. So that may be one nice after effect of all this printing and publishing history, is people are still pretty interested in books.
Right. And I have to say the mobile unit is going to be parked right between Candle in the Night and Keep Ink. And people will not only get an opportunity to hear Bar's Fight, which is Lucy's only surviving work, but also learn a little bit about who she was and how that's pertinent to today. Like, she arguably could be coined as one of our earliest, among the earliest civil rights leaders and fighters, as the princes fought for their land and, argued for their rights, used the law to their advantage. And she's one of our earliest African American poets, and by the time she was in her 40s, that's when Phyllis Wheatley had published her first book of poems. So that puts things in perspective, but we don't see Lucy's work until, and the only surviving work, until 100 years after her death.
So this is all we have time for right now. I did get to hear Bar's Fights read, and it's a intriguing poem and wonderfully written. So I encourage people to check out the Miles mobile unit this week. Just one quick anything else before we go.
Lucy did argue a case to get an order of protection for her family from another family harassing her before the Vermont Supreme Court, and she won.
So she definitely, let's learn more about her. Thank you for bringing her into the sunshine and giving her a good spotlight and platform. Greene Mornings will be back after your weather.